hum of the tires against the cracked asphalt was almost hypnotic, and for a moment, I lost myself in its steady rhythm. I'd been driving for hours, long past sunset, and the road stretched out before me like an endless ribbon cutting through the night. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, just enough to keep me moving forward. There was no one else on the road. No lights in the distance, no cars in my rearview mirror. Just me, the empty highway, and the thick silence pressing in from all sides. The loneliness of it all settled into my bones, making me feel small and out of place, like I'd stumbled into a forgotten corner of the world. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, forcing myself to focus. I told myself I'd stop at the next town, if I ever found one. Maybe get some gas, a quick bite to eat, something to break up this uneasy solitude. That's when I saw him. A figure on the side of the road, his thumb extended, casting a long shadow in the glow of my headlights. I slowed down, the thought of passing him tugging at my conscience. He looked harmless enough, maybe even a bit lost, with his rumpled jacket and a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The kind of guy who looked like he had a rough day, maybe even a rough life. Something about his slumped posture struck a chord with me, stirring a vague sense of pity, or maybe just the need for company. I rolled to a stop beside him and leaned over, rolling down the window. "Need a lift?" He nodded, a faint smile flickering across his face. "If it's not too much trouble. Just heading as far down this road as you're willing to take me." I gestured for him to get in, and he climbed in with a quiet thanks, settling into the passenger seat. I caught a brief glimpse of his face in the dim light, pale, with soft, almost boyish features. Despite the quiet of the night, there was something calming about his presence. Just another weary traveler, I told myself, as I pulled back onto the road. For the first few miles, we didn't talk much. He kept his gaze on the road ahead, occasionally glancing out the window as if he were looking for something. I could feel a subtle tension in the air, but I chalked it up to the usual awkwardness of sharing a confined space with a stranger. Eventually, though, the silence grew too thick, and I cleared my throat, searching for something to say. "So, where are you headed?" He smiled faintly, still staring ahead. "Just passing through. I go where the road takes me." He paused, then added with a touch of nostalgia, "Reminds me a little of the trips I used to take as a kid. My parents would pack up the car and drive us down these winding roads, stopping whenever we found something interesting." I chuckled, trying to relax. "Yeah, I remember those road trips. The best part was always the snacks, you know? My mom would give me those mini chocolate chip cookies. I swear, I must have eaten a lifetime's worth on those drives." He turned to me, his face partially illuminated in the dim light. "Mini chocolate chip cookies," he repeated softly, with a faint smile. "Those were your favorite, right?" For a split second, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My fingers tensed on the steering wheel, and I forced myself to laugh, brushing it off. "Yeah, they were. Weird coincidence." He didn't respond, just kept staring ahead, that slight smile still lingering on his lips. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, glancing over at him from the corner of my eye. "So, you have any favorite snacks from back then?" He tilted his head, considering. "Not really. I was never much for sweets," he replied, almost wistfully. "But I think I remember you. I think I remember kids like you loving those cookies. Just something about the taste that sticks with you." The chill came back, colder this time, worming its way up my spine. The way he'd said it, like he was talking about me specifically, it didn't make any sense. I looked at him again, trying to read his face, but his expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the road like he hadn't said anything strange at all. I laughed, more to fill the silence than out of any real amusement. "Yeah, I guess they're pretty memorable," I said, my voice a little tighter than I intended. He finally turned to look at me, his gaze intense, almost probing. "It's funny, the things we hold on to. The things we think no one else knows." His words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling, like he was speaking about something far deeper than childhood snacks. A prickle of unease spread across my skin. "I guess," I muttered, struggling to keep my tone light. I glanced at him again, but he already turned back to the window, his face disappearing into the shadows. For the next few miles, we drove in silence, my mind racing with questions. How did he know about the cookies? Was it just a lucky guess, or something else? I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was overthinking things. But every time I looked over at him, there was something in his posture, something unreadable in his expression, that made me feel like he knew far more than he was letting on. The miles slipped by in an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the occasional rustle as he adjusted his position. Just as I started to relax, convincing myself it was all in my head, he spoke up again, his voice so soft I almost missed it. "You got a scar on your left knee, don't you?" My heart skipped a beat. "How did you?" He shrugged, that faint smile returning. "Just a hunch." But there was something in his tone that told me he knew exactly what he was talking about. My fingers tightened on the wheel, and I felt my pulse quicken as I tried to keep my breathing steady. How could he know that? It was a scar I'd gotten years ago, back when I was a kid. A stupid fall off my bike. No one would remember that. No one except me. A cold dread settled over me, pressing down like a weight on my chest. I didn't dare look at him, afraid of what I might see in his eyes. I just kept my gaze on the road, silently praying for the drive to be over, for this stranger in my passenger seat to vanish like a bad dream. But he wasn't going anywhere. And somehow, I knew this ride was far from over. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus on the road. I could still feel his presence beside me, calm and unsettling, like he belonged here. The shadows clung to him, obscuring his features, and each time I glanced his way, I felt like I was staring into a void. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that his knowledge of my childhood snack and the scar on my knee was just an odd coincidence. "So," I ventured, trying to mask the unease in my voice, "do you travel a lot?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed ahead. "I get around," he said, his tone casual. "Sometimes alone, sometimes with company." His eyes flicked to me, a gleam in the low light. "Kinda like that trip you took with your family to the Grand Canyon. You were, what, 8? 9? I felt my grip on the steering wheel slip slightly. My family trip to the Grand Canyon. I hadn't thought about that in years. "Yeah, I was 8, I murmured, barely processing the words as I spoke them. My heart began to beat faster, a dull panic simmering beneath the surface. "It was a long time ago. It was the first time you saw the stars so clearly," he continued, his voice soft, almost nostalgic. "You thought they looked like little pinpricks of light, poking holes in the dark. You told your dad that." He let out a low chuckle. "Cute, really." My mouth went dry, and I could feel the beginnings of a tremor in my hands. I hadn't told anyone about that moment. I barely remembered it myself until he mentioned it. How did he know that? "Look, I don't know who you are," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "But I don't remember telling you about that. I didn't tell anyone about that." I forced myself to look at him, searching his face for some hint of an explanation, something that might make sense of the strange familiarity he seemed to have with my life. He met my gaze, his eyes steady, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe you didn't. Or maybe some things just stick with you, even if you don't remember sharing them." I turned back to the road, swallowing hard. The darkness felt thicker now, pressing in on all sides, and I found myself fighting to keep my breathing steady. Just a coincidence, I told myself, even as I felt the prickle of dread creeping up my spine. Just a lucky guess. "So, do you keep in touch with your old high school friends?" he asked, his voice soft and conversational, like we were just two strangers chatting about the past. "No, not really," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to answer him, didn't want to give him any more pieces of me, but my voice came out automatically, like I couldn't help it. "What about Kyle?" he continued, his tone almost playful. "Your best friend back in high school. The two of you were inseparable, weren't you? Always getting into trouble. Like that time you two got caught sneaking into the old abandoned warehouse on Westfield Avenue. What was it you said to the cops? Something about urban exploration?" He chuckled, as if it were some fond memory we shared. I felt a shiver run through me, cold and sharp. Kyle. The warehouse. That was something I'd never told anyone. It wasn't even a memory I thought about often. It was buried so deep that I couldn't even recall the details until he brought it up. My mind raced, trying to piece together how this stranger could know things that I had barely spoken aloud. Who are you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "Are you some kind of private investigator or something? How do you know all this?" He looked at me, his smile fading into something else, something darker, more knowing. "Does it matter? You already know me, don't you?" The pit in my stomach grew heavier, twisting into something close to panic. I glanced at the road, searching for an exit, somewhere I could pull over and end this, get him out of my car. But the road was empty, stretching out endlessly in both directions, as though I were caught in some kind of loop with no way out. The hitchhiker leaned back in his seat, watching me with a casual, almost amused expression, like he was enjoying my discomfort. "You know, it's funny," he mused. "We spend so much time around people, but most of them never really know us. They don't see the little things, the memories we keep locked away." He glanced at me, his gaze piercing. "But you're different." I tried to ignore him, tried to keep my focus on the road, but his words slipped into my mind, each one more invasive than the last, prying open doors I hadn't even known were closed. "And then there was last Tuesday," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You were sitting alone in your living room, staring at that old picture on the wall. The one with your sister, back when you two were kids. You were wondering what might have happened if things had been different. If she were still here." The blood drained from my face. That night, last Tuesday, I'd been alone, and I hadn't told anyone what I'd been thinking. I'd kept it locked inside, the weight of that memory pressing down on me in the darkness. There was no way he could know about that. No way he could know what I'd been thinking. But the look in his eyes told me that he knew exactly what I'd been feeling, as if he'd been sitting there beside me. "Ow." My voice faltered, and I felt my hands begin to shake. "How do you know that?" He didn't answer right away, just watched me, his gaze unwavering, his smile gone. The air in the car felt thick, suffocating, as if it were pressing down on me from all sides. I wanted to scream, to pull over, to throw open the door and escape, but my hands were frozen on the wheel and I couldn't seem to move. "It's strange, isn't it?" he murmured, his voice almost gentle. "How some things just linger, how some things refuse to let go." I turned to him, a flicker of anger breaking through the fear. "Enough. Who are you? How do you know these things about me?" He tilted his head, considering me for a long, silent moment. "Maybe I'm just a friend. Maybe I'm someone who knows you better than you know yourself." The panic tightened its grip around my chest, and I could feel my breaths coming faster, shorter. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. I forced myself to take a steadying breath, keeping my gaze locked on the road as I fought to keep my voice calm. "You need to get out," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know who you are or how you know these things, but I'm done." I don't want to hear another word. But he didn't move. He just sat there, a flicker of amusement in his eyes, as if my panic were nothing more than a game to him. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice soft, taunting. "Are you sure you want me to leave?" My hand tightened on the wheel, and I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his stare pressing down on me. "Yes," I said firmly, refusing to look at him. "Get out. Now." The hitchhiker chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You don't really want me to go?" "Not yet." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, so close I could feel his breath on my ear. "There's still so much more you don't remember." My hands were slick on the wheel, my pulse pounding as I took a deep breath, forcing myself to sound calm. If I could get him to slip up, maybe I'd understand what was going on here. This guy was toying with me, somehow digging into my life like he had access to the most hidden parts of me. But there had to be some kind of explanation, some logic behind this nightmare. "So, if you know so much about me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "maybe you'd like to tell me how we know each other? Or where we met?" He smirked, his eyes gleaming with something like satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting for me to ask. "Oh, we go way back," he said smoothly. "Further back than you realize." That doesn't answer the question. I clenched my jaw, refusing to let him sidestep me. "How do I know you?" He tilted his head, looking at me with something almost like pity. "You don't remember me, but that's okay," he said, his voice gentle, almost mocking. "Memory is a funny thing. Sometimes we forget the things we want to forget. And sometimes, those things find us anyway." I gripped the wheel tighter, a fresh wave of dread washing over me. "Stop with the games. Who are you?" He ignored me, a slight smile playing on his lips. "You used to love exploring the woods behind your house as a kid, didn't you? Thought of yourself as a little adventurer. You even bring that old flashlight with the flickering beam." He chuckled. "But then, there was that one day. The day you wandered too far and found something you weren't supposed to see." My stomach twisted as a long-buried memory surfaced, a memory I tried to forget. I'd been 7, playing in the woods behind my childhood home, chasing fireflies and pretending I was an explorer in some uncharted forest. That day, I'd stumbled upon an old, crumbling shed, hidden deep among the trees. The door had been slightly ajar, and I'd felt a strange pull to look inside. When I did, I didn't want to remember what I'd seen. I buried that memory so deeply I could barely recall it myself. I kept my gaze fixed on the road, trying to block out his words. "That was a long time ago," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "It doesn't matter. "Oh, but it does," he replied softly, his tone laced with something dark. "You tried so hard to forget, but memories like that don't just disappear. They leave marks, even if you can't see them." I felt a prickle of something icy in my chest, a feeling I hadn't felt in years. "Look, you need to stop," I said, my voice faltering. "You don't know what you're talking about." He leaned back, watching me with an unsettling calm. "Don't I?" he asked, his voice soft and knowing. "How about your cousin, Daniel? You were only 12 when he came to visit that summer. He was your best friend, practically your brother. You thought you'd be friends for life." The mention of Daniel felt like a punch to the gut. I hadn't thought about him in years, hadn't wanted to. We'd been inseparable that summer, spending every day together, talking about the things we'd do when we got older. But something had happened between us, something I'd pushed so far down that it barely felt real. The hitchhiker seemed to read my silence, his gaze piercing. "And then, one night, he told you something. Something that scared you." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you didn't believe him, did you?" My heart pounded, my skin cold with sweat. I clenched my jaw, refusing to look at him. "Stop," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't know how you know these things, but I don't want to hear any more." He laughed softly, the sound sending chills down my spine. "You can't keep hiding from it," he said, his voice both gentle and menacing. "From the things you did. The things you left behind." A sickening dread twisted in my stomach as I tried to piece together what he was getting at. I hadn't done anything wrong. I was just a kid back then, and whatever I'd done, whatever mistakes I'd made, they were nothing compared to this invasion, this stranger who somehow knew the darkest corners of my mind. But he wasn't finished. "You're not as innocent as you like to think, are you?" he said softly, his words dripping with malice. "You've made your share of mistakes. Maybe that's why your wife left." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My wife. The divorce was recent, the wound still fresh and raw. I hadn't told anyone about the details, hadn't even admitted to myself the reasons why it had all fallen apart. But here he was, digging into that pain as if he'd been there, as if he'd watched everything unravel. "Who told you that?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "How do you know about her?" He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I've been with you all along," he murmured. "Maybe I know everything you try to keep hidden because I'm a part of it." My mind spun, and I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. I wanted to pull over, to kick him out of the car, to escape from this nightmare. But the road stretched on, dark and endless, with no exit in sight. He leaned closer, his voice low and insidious. "You remember that night in the woods, don't you? You heard something, didn't you? Something that made you run. But you never told anyone what you heard. You just locked it away, tried to pretend it was all a dream." The memory was hazy, clouded by years of repression, but his words brought it back in sharp, terrible clarity. I remembered the sound, a voice, whispering from the shadows, calling my name. I'd run, terrified, my flashlight flickering as I stumbled through the trees. I'd told myself it was my imagination, that it was nothing more than a child's fear of the dark. But now, with him beside me, it felt real, like I'd never left that forest. "How do you know about that?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Were you there?" He smiled, his expression dark and knowing. "I've always been there," he said softly. "Watching. Waiting. You can't hide from me. I shook my head, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. No. This is insane. Is it? He asked, his tone mocking. Or are you just finally remembering? His words echoed in my mind, twisting around my thoughts until I could barely tell what was real and what was memory. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in this car with him, his presence filling the space with a darkness I couldn't escape. Tell me what you want, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. He tilted his head, considering me for a long, agonizing moment. What I want is for you to stop running, he said, his voice soft, almost kind. To stop pretending you're someone you're not. My pulse quickened, and I felt a surge of anger, a desperate need to push back against him, to fight against the terror he was planting in my mind. You don't know anything about me, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. Oh, but I do, he replied, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. I know every lie you've ever told. Every mistake you've ever made. And I know the things you try to forget. His gaze turned piercing, as if he could see straight through me. I know about the fire. The fire. My heart stilled, my breath catching in my throat. That was something I hadn't thought about in years, a memory so deeply buried I'd almost convinced myself it was nothing more than a bad dream. I'd been young, barely a teenager, and I'd been playing with matches in the backyard, just to see what would happen. But something had gone wrong, and before I knew it, the flames had spread, licking up the side of the old shed. I'd been terrified, scrambling to put it out, watching helplessly as the fire consumed everything. No one had ever found out. I'd managed to hide the damage, convincing my parents it was an accident, that it had been caused by something else. I'd buried the memory so deeply that even I had almost forgotten it. But he knew. Somehow, this stranger knew. I stared at him, a sick feeling twisting in my gut. What are you? I whispered, the words barely audible. He smiled, his eyes cold and unreadable. I'm the part of you that you try to hide, he murmured, his voice soft and chilling. The part that knows every secret you bury, every mistake you make. You can't get rid of me, because I am you. A shudder ran through me, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. His words echoed in my mind, wrapping around me like a noose, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I wanted to scream, to throw open the door and run, but I was frozen, trapped in this car. With him, unable to escape the twisted truth he'd forced me to face. My foot hovered over the brake, the urge to pull over and end this nightmare stronger than ever. The hitchhiker sat there, calm and almost smug, as if he knew I was debating whether or not to throw him out of the car right then. But before I could act, he began to speak again, his voice low and unsettlingly familiar. You've been struggling lately, haven't you? He murmured, as if he were speaking only to himself. The late nights, lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if you've made the right choices. Thinking about all the things you've lost. About everything you failed to fix. My heart skipped a beat. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, fighting to keep my breathing steady. This stranger didn't just know my past, he was prying into my present, the private corners of my life that I hadn't shared with anyone. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my pulse hammering. I don't know what you're talking about, I replied, forcing a casual tone into my voice. But he just chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, you can pretend all you want. I know the truth. You think about it every night, don't you? You think about the empty space beside you in bed, the silence that used to be filled with someone else's laughter. He glanced at me, his eyes sharp and knowing. You wonder if it was your fault, if maybe you're the reason she left. I could feel my chest tightening, a dull ache settling in as he spoke. The loneliness, the guilt, those were things I'd kept hidden, things I'd barely admitted to myself, let alone anyone else. I swallowed hard, clenching my jaw against the wave of emotion his words stirred up. You don't know anything about that, I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. You're just guessing. He looked at me with a pitying expression, as if he could see right through my bravado. I know more than you think, he said quietly. I know that every day, you wonder if things could have been different. If maybe, just maybe, there's still a chance for you. I glanced at him, a flicker of anger breaking through my fear. Who do you think you are? I demanded. Some kind of psychic? You don't know anything about my future. A slow, unsettling smile spread across his face. Oh, but I do, he replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. I know exactly what's going to happen to you. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold prickle of dread creep up my spine. His words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, like a storm cloud looming just out of reach. I tried to shake it off, to remind myself that he was just a stranger, that he couldn't possibly know anything about what was going to happen in my life. But there was something in his gaze, something dark and certain, that made it hard to ignore. Look, I said, forcing a calm I didn't feel, I don't know how you know these things, but whatever it is you're trying to do, it's not going to work. I don't believe you. He leaned back, his expression unreadable. Sue yourself, he said, his tone almost bored. But it won't change anything. You can ignore it all you want, pretend that none of this is real. But the truth has a funny way of finding you, no matter how hard you try to avoid it. I clenched my jaw, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The darkness outside seemed to press in closer, the road stretching endlessly ahead, with no sign of civilization in sight. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, but the numbers looked strange, as if they were shifting, blurring before my eyes. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the unease only grew. You think you're safe, the hitchhiker continued, his voice soft and taunting. That as long as you keep driving, as long as you don't look back, you can leave everything behind. But the past has a way of catching up to you, doesn't it? I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the shiver that ran through me. Why don't you just tell me what you're trying to say? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. What is it you think you know? He smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that made my skin crawl. Oh, I know a lot of things, he said softly. I know about that night 2 weeks ago, when you thought no one was watching. When you did something you swore you'd never do again. My heart pounded, a surge of panic rising in my chest. 2 weeks ago. That was impossible. I hadn't told anyone about that night, about the way I'd slipped back into old habits, the way I'd let myself be pulled down by the weight of my own regrets. I'd convinced myself it was a one-time thing, a moment of weakness I could bury and forget. But he knew. Somehow, he knew. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice unsteady. He chuckled, shaking his head. Denial is a powerful thing, isn't it? He murmured. But it won't save you. You can try to run, to hide from the truth, but sooner or later, you'll have to face it. And when that moment comes, he trailed off, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside the window, as if he were seeing something far beyond the stretch of empty road. I felt a chill run through me, the air in the car thick and suffocating. I wanted to stop, to pull over and get him out of my car, but some twisted sense of dread kept me driving, kept me locked in this surreal nightmare. You know, he continued, his tone almost thoughtful, we all have a moment when we're forced to confront the things we've been avoiding. A moment when we're given a choice. He looked at me, his eyes dark and unblinking. That moment is coming for you, sooner than you think. I forced to laugh, though it sounded hollow and forced. What, are you some kind of prophet now? He shrugged, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just someone who knows you better than you know yourself. He leaned closer, his gaze intense. Tell me, have you ever wondered why you keep driving? Why you can't seem to turn around, to go back? The question hung in the air, thick and heavy. I wanted to say no, to deny the strange compulsion that had kept me on this road, but the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running from something. That if I stopped, if I turned around, I'd have to face something I wasn't ready to face. You can't escape it, he murmured, his voice soft and taunting. You can't run forever. My hand shook, and I tightened my grip on the wheel, fighting to keep control. I don't know what you're trying to do, but it's not going to work, I said, my voice strained. He chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, I'm not trying to do anything, he replied. I'm just here to watch. To see what choice you make when the time comes. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding as his words echoed in my mind. I wanted to believe he was lying, that he was just some twisted stranger who'd found a way to mess with me, but the certainty in his gaze made it hard to ignore. There was something chillingly real about the way he spoke, as if he were seeing things I couldn't, things that were yet to happen. So what's it going to be? He asked, his tone casual, almost amused. Are you going to keep driving, pretending you're in control? Or are you going to face what's waiting for you? I stared at him, a surge of anger breaking through my fear. What do you want from me? He shrugged, leaning back with a satisfied smile. Nothing at all. I'm just here to witness what happens next. His words hung in the air, thick and ominous, as if they were a challenge, a dare to keep going, to see where this nightmare would lead. I gritted my teeth, refusing to let him see how much he was getting to me. But as I drove, the road stretched on, endless and empty, and a sickening realization settled over me. There was no turning back. No exit, no way out. It was as if I were trapped in this car with him, destined to keep driving, to face whatever dark truth he seemed to be waiting for. And in the silence, I could almost hear a faint, mocking whisper, "You can't run forever." A chill crept down my spine as he began speaking again, his words soft and casual, as if he were merely commenting on the weather. But what he was saying wasn't casual. Not by any stretch. You know, your bedroom is quite cozy, he murmured, his gaze distant, as if he were seeing it in his mind's eye. The way you keep the curtains drawn, just enough to block out the streetlight. It's always so dark in there. Must make it hard to sleep, though, with all those shadows. My grip tightened on the wheel, a fresh wave of dread washing over me. The hitchhiker had no way of knowing that. No way at all. My curtains were heavy, thick enough to keep out the light, but I'd left them just an inch open, a crack of streetlight slipping through like a thin blade across the floor. It was a detail so small, so insignificant that I never mentioned it to anyone. I forced a laugh, though it sounded weak even to my own ears. Lucky guess. He just smiled, a faint, unsettling curve of his lips. Oh, I'm not guessing. He turned to look at me, his eyes gleaming with something dark and knowing. I've seen it. The way you lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about the things that haunt you. The things you can't run from. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding as I tried to keep my breathing steady. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He was just a stranger, a drifter with a strange gift for reading people, someone who'd gotten lucky with a few unsettling guesses. But his words were chipping away at my sanity, each revelation more precise, more deeply personal than the last. "And that picture by your bed," he continued, his voice a low murmur. "The one of you and her, on your honeymoon, when you still thought love could solve everything. You can't bear to throw it away, can you? Even though it's cracked now, the frame split from when you threw it that night." A cold, sickening knot tightened in my stomach. That picture was hidden in a drawer beside my bed, the frame cracked from the night I'd hurled it across the room in a fit of anger. I hadn't looked at it in months, hadn't told anyone about it. Yet he described it as if he'd seen it himself, as if he'd been in my bedroom, watching me as I tried to forget. "You're lying," I muttered, my voice trembling. He raised an eyebrow, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Am I?" I tried to keep my eyes on the road, but my hands were shaking, my thoughts spinning in a chaotic whirl of fear and disbelief. I couldn't let myself believe that he knew these things, that he'd somehow been inside my home, watching me. But his gaze was so steady, so certain, that it was hard to hold onto my doubt. "And then there's the trunk," he said, his voice soft and almost playful. "Do you even remember what you put in there? All those things you tried to forget about?" I stiffened, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. The trunk. I hadn't opened it in weeks, hadn't thought about what was in there, or at least, I tried not to. There were things in that trunk I put there because I didn't want to see them, things I'd hoped I could just leave behind. Old journals, letters, mementos from a life I barely recognized anymore. He chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "Oh, you remember, don't you? That box of letters you thought you could burn, the way you clung to each word even as you tried to let it go. And the old watch, the one that doesn't work anymore. You tell yourself you keep it because it was your father's, but really, you keep it because it reminds you of the time you lost, all those hours you'll never get back." I stared at him, my mind reeling. That watch had been my father's, a broken relic I kept out of guilt, out of some twisted need to cling to the past. I'd hidden it in the trunk, along with all the other things I couldn't let go of, and yet somehow, he knew. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He just smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that seemed to stretch wider with every second. "I'm the one who's been watching," he murmured, his voice soft and sinister. "The one who's always been there, in the shadows, just beyond your sight." A shudder ran through me, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. "That's impossible. You're just a stranger. You can't know these things." "Can I?" he asked, tilting his head as he studied me. "Or maybe, deep down, you've always known I was there. Watching. Waiting." The air in the car felt thick, suffocating, as if his presence were swallowing up all the oxygen. I wanted to pull over, to throw him out, to escape from this nightmare, but my body felt frozen, my mind paralyzed by the horror of his words. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He looked at me, his gaze intense, almost pitying. "Because you need to remember," he said softly. "You need to remember all the things you've tried so hard to forget. The mistakes you've buried, the secrets you've hidden. You can't keep running from them forever." I shook my head, my mind spinning. "I don't understand." "Oh, but you do," he replied, his voice dark and certain. "You understand perfectly. You just don't want to face it." A silence fell between us, heavy and oppressive, as his words sank in, twisting around my thoughts like a vine. I tried to think of a way out, a way to end this, but every thought led back to him, to the dark certainty in his gaze. "I know everything about you," he murmured, his voice soft and chilling. "Every lie, every secret. I know what you hide from the world, but parts of yourself you keep locked away." I could feel my heart pounding, my skin cold with sweat. He spoke as if he were reading the deepest, darkest parts of my soul, as if he'd seen every moment of my life, every choice I'd ever made. And the worst part was, I couldn't deny it. Somehow, he knew. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his gaze piercing, unyielding. "I want you to face the truth," he said softly. "To stop pretending. To stop hiding from the things you've done." I swallowed hard, my mind racing as his words sank in. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but something in his gaze held me captive, something dark and certain that I couldn't escape. "And what if I don't?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He smiled, a slow, sinister smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Then you'll keep running," he murmured. "But no matter how far you go, no matter how fast you drive, you'll never escape me. Because I'm always there. Watching." A shiver ran through me, a sickening dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I wanted to believe he was lying, that this was some twisted joke, but the certainty in his gaze made it hard to deny. "And one day," he continued, his voice low and ominous, "you'll have to face me. You'll have to face everything you've tried to bury." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding as his words echoed in my mind. I wanted to scream, to pull over and escape, but some twisted sense of dread kept me driving, kept me locked in this nightmare. I glanced at him, my mind spinning with questions, with terror, but his expression was calm, almost serene, as if he knew something I didn't. As if he'd already seen what was coming, what lay ahead on this dark, endless road. "You can try to ignore it," he said softly, "but you'll never be free. Not until you face the truth. Not until you stop running." I could feel my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, my mind reeling as his words sank in. I wanted to fight back, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, some part of me knew he was right. I'd been running for so long, hiding from the things I couldn't face, the things I didn't want to admit. And now, here he was, forcing me to confront it all. I glanced at him, a surge of anger breaking through my fear. "What gives you the right?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What gives you the right to judge me?" He just smiled, a dark, unsettling smile that seemed to cut through the darkness. "I don't need the right," he murmured. "I'm a part of you, after all. The part you can't escape." A chill ran through me, his words sinking deep into my mind, twisting around my thoughts like a vice. I wanted to pull over, to stop the car and throw him out, but the road stretched on, endless and empty, with no way out in sight. And as I drove, his voice echoed in my mind, soft and sinister, a dark reminder of the truth I'd been running from. "You can't run forever." I could feel the weight of my desperation pressing down on me, suffocating, as I gripped the wheel, my knuckles turning white. The darkness outside the car loomed, thick and oppressive, but it was nothing compared to the heaviness that settled in my chest with each of the hitchhiker's revelations. I needed to confront him, to break the silence that felt like a noose tightening around my throat. "What do you want?" I shouted, the words bursting from me in a raw surge of frustration. "Why are you doing this? What is it you want from me?" He turned to me, his expression calm and collected, a smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. "I want you to face yourself," he replied, his voice low and smooth, almost soothing. "I want you to confront the darkness you've buried so deep inside. The things you've never dared to share with anyone." The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, caught in the crosshairs of his intense gaze. It felt as if he were peeling back layers of my psyche, exposing the raw, unhealed wounds I had so carefully concealed. "You think you can scare me into submission?" I snapped, trying to regain control. "You think you can play mind games with me? I'm not afraid of you." He chuckled softly, a sound that sent chills racing through me. "Oh, but you are. You're terrified. You've been running from these truths for so long, and you think you can outrun them. But here I am, reminding you that no matter how far you go, you'll always be haunted by your past." I tried to shake it off, but the panic clawed at me, and I felt myself slipping into a spiraling panic. "What do you know about my past?" I demanded, the edge of fear creeping into my voice. "What do you think you can possibly understand?" He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing, and I could see the darkness swirling behind them like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. "I know all about that night," he said softly, his tone conspiratorial, as if sharing a secret. "The night you made a choice that would change everything. The night you turned your back on everything you believed in." I swallowed hard, my throat dry and tight. It was as if he'd reached into my mind, dredging up memories I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten they existed. But I hadn't forgotten. I couldn't. The guilt had festered, a dark stain on my soul that refused to fade. "That night, it was just a mistake," I said, my voice wavering. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I thought I could fix it." "But you didn't," he replied, his voice low and cold. "You thought you could just walk away. But that's the thing about mistakes, isn't it? They don't just vanish. They linger, they haunt you, no matter how much you try to ignore them." I shook my head, my heart racing as the memories flooded back. The heat of the argument, the shattering glass, the way everything had spiraled out of control in a matter of seconds. It was a moment I replayed over and over, a memory that gnawed at my insides like a ravenous beast. "I had no choice," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "I didn't know what to do." "But you did have a choice," he insisted, his voice dripping with disdain. "You chose to ignore the signs. You chose to let your fears dictate your actions. And now you're living with the consequences." I felt the walls closing in, a claustrophobic sensation that threatened to suffocate me. "What do you want from me?" I shouted again, the desperation creeping back into my voice. "Why are you doing this?" He leaned back, a satisfied glint in his eyes. "I want you to face your fears. To confront the truth that's been gnawing at you. Because I know what you're really afraid of." I felt my heart skip a beat, a cold sweat breaking out across my brow. "What do you mean?" "You're afraid of being alone," he said, his voice smooth, as if he were drawing out a confession. "Afraid that the mistakes you've made will cost you everything. You're terrified that you'll end up just like your father, wandering through life, never able to connect with anyone, always running." A deep ache settled in my chest at the mention of my father. I could feel the anger rising within me, but it was overshadowed by an overwhelming sense of dread. "You don't know anything about my father," I shot back, my voice trembling. "You don't know what I've been through." He smiled, that same, chilling smile that sent shivers racing down my spine. "But I do. I know all about your father. I know about the way he'd come home late, reeking of whiskey, and how you'd hide in your room, praying he wouldn't find you. You're scared of becoming him, scared of repeating the same mistakes. His words were like daggers, piercing through the defenses I'd built around my heart. I wanted to scream, to tell him to stop, but it was as if he were unraveling the very fabric of my being, pulling at threads I didn't even know existed. You're afraid of losing everyone you love, he continued, his voice low and unyielding. Of ending up completely alone because of the choices you've made. You think if you keep running, you can avoid it, but the truth is, you're just delaying the inevitable. I shook my head, my mind spinning, desperate to escape the reality he was laying bare before me. I don't want to hear this, I said, my voice barely a whisper. You don't know what I've been through. Don't I? He replied, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in closer. I know everything. The way you pushed her away when she needed you the most. The way you let fear dictate your choices, turning your back on the people who cared about you. I know about the fight, the way you walked away thinking it would fix things, only to find it shattered everything. I felt sick, the memories crashing over me like waves, each one more painful than the last. I thought I could fix it, I choked out, tears stinging my eyes. I thought it would be okay. But it wasn't, was it? He pressed, his voice relentless. And deep down, you know it. You know that you can't keep running. You can't escape the truth forever. His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as the reality of my past washed over me, drowning me in guilt and regret. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but instead, I felt my resolve crumbling, the weight of my choices pressing down on me like an anchor. What do you want me to do? I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. I want you to stop running, he said softly, his tone suddenly serious. I want you to face the things you've hidden away. You can't keep pretending they don't exist. You need to confront the choices you've made, the people you've hurt. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he was right. I'd been running for so long, hiding from my mistakes, trying to pretend they didn't matter. But the truth was, they haunted me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment I'd finally have to face them. Do you remember what you said to her that night? He continued, his voice dripping with malice. Do you remember how you made her feel? The way you shattered her world? You can't keep ignoring that. Tears streamed down my face as the memories crashed over me like a tidal wave, dragging me down into the depths of my guilt. I remembered the look in her eyes, the way she pleaded with me to understand, and how I turned my back on her in a fit of rage. I had hurt her in a way I could never take back. I didn't mean it, I stammered, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. I didn't mean any of it. Maybe not, he replied, his voice cold and unyielding. But the damage is done. And you have to face it. You have to confront the truth if you ever want to move forward. I felt a wave of despair wash over me, suffocating as the darkness of my past enveloped me. I wanted to pull over, to escape, but the road stretched on endlessly, and he was still there beside me, a dark reminder of everything I was trying to run from. What do I do? I whispered, my voice shaking. Stop running, he said again, his tone softer now, almost pleading. Face it. Confront the truth. Only then can you be free. I could feel the tears streaming down my face as I drove, the weight of his words crushing me beneath their gravity. I didn't know if I could face it. I didn't know if I was strong enough to confront the pain of my past. But as I continued down the empty road, the darkness pressing in around me, I knew one thing. I couldn't keep running forever. The truth was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment I'd finally have to confront it. And with the hitchhiker beside me, I realized I was closer to that moment than I'd ever been before. The road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt winding through the darkness, each curve taking me deeper into uncertainty. My heart raced as I scanned the horizon, desperate for a sign of civilization or an excuse to escape the hitchhiker who had taken root in my car. But as I finally reached the end of my tether, I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. "We're stopping," I said, forcing the words through gritted teeth. "Get out." The hitchhiker's demeanor shifted in an instant, his calm facade crumbling like dry leaves in the wind. He turned to me, his eyes narrowing, a predatory glint igniting within their depths. "Oh, but why would I do that?" he replied, his voice now laced with a chilling menace. "We're having such an enlightening conversation." The air in the car thickened with tension, and I could feel the heat rising from my skin. "I'm serious," I pressed, my voice trembling. "Get out." His smile broadened, revealing a set of teeth that seemed far too sharp. "You think you can just order me out of your car? That it's that easy?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent ice running down my spine. "You're not the first person I've accompanied on a lonely drive, you know." The weight of his words sank deep into my gut, and panic gripped me like a vice. "What do you mean?" I whispered, though I felt the answer clawing at the edges of my mind, a darkness I was too afraid to confront. "Oh, I've been with many," he continued, his tone almost teasing, as if he were recounting a delightful secret. "You see, I have a knack for finding those who are lost. Those who think they can outrun their past." His eyes gleamed with an unholy light, and my breath hitched in my throat. A sickening realization washed over me, and I recoiled, pressing my back against the seat as if I could create distance between us. "What are you saying? What have you done?" He leaned back, his posture relaxed, as if he were merely sharing a story over coffee rather than insinuating something far darker. "Let's just say that the road is littered with souls who thought they could escape their fate. They believed they could just leave it all behind, but fate has a way of catching up with you." He chuckled softly, a sound devoid of warmth echoing in the small confines of the car. The weight of his words pressed heavily on my chest. A chill ran down my spine as I processed his implication. "You're threatening me," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "You can't." "I'm not threatening you," he interrupted, his voice cool and smooth, but the menace was unmistakable. "I'm merely stating facts. You're not the first to attempt to shake me off, and you certainly won't be the last." Desperation clawed at my mind, and I fumbled for the door handle, the urge to escape becoming an instinctual reflex. But my limbs felt heavy, weighed down by an invisible force as I realized the truth: he wasn't going to let me go. The darkness that cloaked him seemed to seep into the very fabric of the car, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. "Please," I said, my voice trembling. "Just let me go. I don't want any trouble." His laughter rang out, sharp and mocking, echoing off the windshield. "Trouble? Oh, my dear driver, trouble is precisely what you've invited into your life. You can't simply wish it away." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a random encounter. He had seen through my carefully constructed facade, peeling back the layers to reveal my vulnerabilities, my fears, and now, my desperation. I felt the walls closing in, the car becoming a tomb, and I fought against the rising tide of panic that threatened to engulf me. "Get out of my car," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Please, Just leave me alone." "Why would I do that?" he mused, his tone mocking. "I have such an interest in you, in your story. It's not often I come across someone so complicated, so broken." The weight of his gaze was unbearable, and I fought the urge to look away, to deny the truth he was laying bare before me. "I'm not broken," I said, but the words rang hollow in my ears, a feeble attempt at bravado. "Ah, but you are," he replied, his voice silky smooth. "You just don't realize it yet. But don't worry, I'm here to help you see it. To guide you through the darkness you've tried to escape." I felt the breath catch in my throat as dread pulled in my stomach. "What do you want from me?" I asked again, desperate for an answer, a way out of this nightmare. He leaned in closer, his voice low and conspiratorial. "I want to show you the truth, the reality of your life. The choices you've made, the paths you've taken, and the consequences that come with them." I could barely breathe, the air thick with tension as he continued. "And I think you know, deep down, that you can't escape it. You can't run from what you've done. You're destined to face it, one way or another." The truth of his words resonated deep within me, and I felt the floodgates of my past threatening to burst open, memories clawing their way to the surface, each one more haunting than the last. "You don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm not like them. I can't be like them." "Oh, but you already are," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "You've made choices that will lead you down the same dark paths. And I'm here to remind you of that, to ensure you don't forget." The realization hit me like a slap in the face, a chilling certainty that wrapped around my heart and squeezed. I was trapped, ensnared in this car with a monster who fed on fear and regret, who reveled in the darkness that lingered within me. My pulse quickened, and I could feel panic rising like bile in my throat. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, desperation spilling over. "Do you want me to confess? To admit my sins?" "Confession?" he scoffed, his expression darkening. "No, my dear driver. I want you to confront the darkness head on. To acknowledge the consequences of your actions. Only then can you truly begin to understand the weight of your choices." His gaze bore into me, piercing through my defenses, and I felt the truth of his words resonate deep within. "I can't," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "I can't face it. I can't." "You must," he interrupted, his voice a chilling command. "You must face it, or you will remain trapped in this cycle of fear and regret, forever haunted by the shadows of your past." I felt the walls closing in around me, the darkness seeping into my very being. My mind raced, searching for an escape, a way out of this hellish nightmare, but the reality was undeniable. I was stuck in this car with a hitchhiker who knew far too much about me, and he had no intention of letting me go. "Please," I begged again, my voice breaking. "Just let me leave. I'll do anything. Just let me go." But he only smiled, a slow, menacing grin that revealed the truth I had feared all along. "There's no escape for you, driver. You're bound to this moment, to this truth. The road ahead is fraught with danger, but only you can choose to confront it." My heart raced, and I could feel the cold grip of despair tightening around me. The reality of my situation crashed over me like a wave, and for the first time, I understood the true weight of my choices. I was at a crossroads, and whether I liked it or not, I had to face the demons lurking in the shadows of my past. And as I sat there, frozen in fear, I knew one thing: I couldn't escape this encounter alive if I didn't confront the darkness within me. The hitchhiker wasn't just a random stranger, he was a harbinger of my past, a reminder that I could no longer run from the truth. As the shadows of night began to recede, giving way to the first hints of dawn, I felt the cold grip of despair tighten around my chest. I was running out of options. The weight of the hitchhiker's revelations pressed down on me, a suffocating reminder of the darkness I had been trying to escape. My heart raced as I clutched the steering wheel, the engine humming softly beneath me, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in my mind. "I can't do this," I whispered, desperation clawing at my throat. "I need to get away from you. I need to leave this behind." The hitchhiker leaned closer, his gaze piercing through me like daggers. "You think running away will solve anything?" he asked, his voice low and chilling. "You think you can just drive into the sunrise and leave it all behind? It doesn't work that way, my friend. You know that." "Stop it," I snapped, panic igniting my voice. "Just get out. I don't want to hear any more of your twisted games." He chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Oh, but this isn't a game. I'm here to show you the truth, whether you like it or not. And trust me, the truth can be a terrifying thing." In that moment, something shifted within me. A flicker of defiance sparked as I looked out into the darkening road ahead. "I don't have to listen to you," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I'll drive until I find a place to escape this nightmare." "Will you?" he replied, a sinister smile creeping across his face. "And what if I told you I know a secret? A secret that could destroy you, that could unravel everything you've worked for? Would you still want to drive away then?" My breath caught in my throat, and a wave of dread crashed over me. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my pulse racing. "What do you know?" He leaned back, reveling in my discomfort, as if he were savoring my growing unease. "I know about the incident," he said, his voice a dark whisper. "The one you've buried deep inside, the one you thought no one would ever find out about. The truth you've hidden away like a dirty little secret." A lump formed in my throat as I fought to swallow down the panic rising within me. "I don't know what you mean," I said, but the tremor in my voice betrayed me. I could feel the shadows of my past creeping in, threatening to engulf me. "Oh, but you do," he pressed, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. "I know what happened that night. The choices you made, the lives you shattered. And I'm here to remind you that you can't run from it forever." Each word struck me like a physical blow, and I felt the breath leave my lungs. Memories rushed back, unbidden, flooding my mind with guilt and shame. I had tried so hard to forget, to erase the stain on my soul, but here it was, lurking in the dark corners of my mind, ready to consume me whole. "You don't know anything," I insisted, though my voice trembled with uncertainty. "Oh, but I do," he continued, his tone chillingly calm. "I know everything, the secrets you thought were safe, the things you've done that would make you shudder if you dared to remember them. And I'm here to ensure you never forget. I can destroy you with just one word, one revelation." Panic surged within me, and I felt the weight of his words pressing down like an anchor, pulling me into an abyss I had fought so hard to avoid. "You're lying," I spat, desperation fueling my denial. "You're just trying to scare me." "Am I?" he replied, tilting his head as if genuinely intrigued. "Or am I simply holding a mirror up to your soul, forcing you to confront the truth that lurks beneath the surface? You know what I'm talking about." The darkness threatened to swallow me whole as I felt my grip on reality slip. The truth was there, buried deep within me, festering like an untreated wound. I could feel the memories rising, clawing their way to the surface, and I struggled to push them back down. "I'm not afraid of you," I lied, my voice wavering. "Then face it," he challenged, leaning closer, his breath hot against my skin. "Face what you've done. Or drive away, and let me be the shadow that follows you wherever you go." I gripped the wood tighter, my knuckles white with fear and rage. The road ahead stretched into uncertainty, but the thought of leaving him behind filled me with dread. I could feel his presence in the car, an oppressive weight that threatened to crush me. "Tell me," I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you know?" His smile widened, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "I know everything about the night you chose to walk away. The night you left someone behind, thinking it would be easier. But you don't get to walk away from the consequences of your choices." The memories surged, and I felt my heart race as the details flooded back. The argument, the shattered glass, the screaming. It had all happened in an instant, and I had thought I could escape it. I had thought it was over. But it wasn't. The fear settled into my bones as I realized the truth. I was trapped, ensnared in a web of my own making. The hitchhiker wasn't just a random stranger, he was a reflection of everything I had tried to bury, the embodiment of my guilt and regret. "Leave me alone," I shouted, desperation clawing at my throat. "I don't want to hear this." But he only leaned closer, his voice dripping with malice. "You can't escape the truth, driver. It's always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment you can no longer run. And that moment is coming." Dawn's light began to creep into the sky, illuminating the road ahead, but the darkness within me remained. I had a choice to make: confront the horrific truth he was revealing, or attempt to leave him behind for good, knowing that I would carry the weight of my past with me wherever I went. I glanced out at the horizon, the sun breaking through the clouds, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. But then I turned back to him, the hitchhiker's eyes gleaming with a malevolent hunger, and the reality of my situation crashed down upon me like a tidal wave. "Tell me what you know," I whispered, my voice trembling. He leaned back, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Ah, but you see, that's the thing. You already know. You just have to face it. The question is, are you brave enough to confront your demons? Or will you choose to run?" As the first rays of sunlight spilled into the car, I realized the choice lay before me, but the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. The hitchhiker leaned in, his eyes dark and knowing, and I felt a chill race down my spine. In that moment, I understood that the road ahead would never truly be free of shadows. No matter which path I chose, the truth would always linger, haunting me like a specter in the rearview mirror. I could run, but I would never escape the consequences of my past. And as dawn broke over the horizon, illuminating the road ahead, I knew one thing for certain: I would be forever haunted by the choices I had made, the secrets I had buried, and the hitchhiker who had forced me to confront them.